facility management which we have prepared more on the administrative side. Then we will come to the clinical management. We will request Dr. Guleria to take over. So quickly, within 5 minutes, if you can run through this.
Just to give the overall perspective, we realize that the number of cases have increased to focus on the case management because this is a big implication. Any
Mute me, Abhi. Mute करना.
I would just like to rush to just to issue the perspective. We realize that if we do the review of CFR, that is case fatality, states have 85% of COVID deaths, and 5 states are having CFR which is more than the national average. And here the pertinent point of highlighting, if you also go by WHO guideline, it stays in a flu of this magnitude or any flu, more than 1% that are not expected. So this should be our internal thought process or target in terms of working how we can sort of save lives. If we see that there are comorbidities, and we decide that we have taken these comorbidities and based on death rate, we realize these comorbidities are 2 to 5 times higher deaths are getting reported. And this also shows us that we also need to parallelly focus on management of comorbidities. Next slide. We also see, if we see the high CFR states, which are primarily Gujarat, Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh, West Bengal, and Delhi, we also see that in high CFR states, people with comorbidity, just to give an example, of 45 to 59 years, if low CFR state, comorbidity death ratio is around 6.5%. It is as high as 17.3%. That is around 3 times approximately higher cases in a high CFR state, and which has implication in terms of what processes we need to put in place so as to manage the cases. If we see what would be, I mean, there are issues related to testing, there are issues related to hospital admission and case management, there are issues related to the capacity of the health staff which is managing the cases, and there are also issues related with infection prevention. And for all these reasons, I would just like to sort of touch upon the issue that there are delays in testing of vulnerable patients, which can also impact high case fatality. And I would just like to highlight a facility from 18% CFR which quoted asymptomatic and non-contact comorbid suspects are not prioritized in testing guidelines. We recorded 70% comorbid deaths, of which some patients could not be tested till they had developed symptoms of their complications. So the point to highlight here is that we need to focus on early testing and treatment for the vulnerable segment. There is a case with respect to high infection amongst healthcare workers, particularly observed in districts with high CFR. So we need to kindly focus on that as an important intervention. And we would just like to highlight our facility has recorded 250 plus LPW infections to date. Guidelines allow only testing only asymptomatic or symptomatic and exposed SPW. We tested our first asymptomatic SPW when our non-COVID IPD patient tested positive. So we kindly also need to focus in terms of the infection within the healthcare workers, and we need to work on that. Second issue is with respect to late referrals and identification complication. And just to give a data of cases in Gujarat, in facility 1, after 1.5 days being on ventilator, the patient died. In another facility, after 2.6 days, the person died. So what it is implying is that if we are able to actually get the patient in right time, so the patient can be saved, so end-to-end case management becomes critical. We also need to focus on basically lack of uniform or effective clinical management protocol for vulnerable patients, which can result in preventable deaths. What we expect from all the center of excellences who are present here today is primarily a framework wherein AIIMS Delhi becomes the overall leader, and then all these center of excellences in collaboration with all the health facilities across the districts, across all over the state, they focus on root causes and high impact interventions which are needed, how to prevent infection spread in facilities, and what are the new therapies which are coming and which should be uniformly applied. There has to be a process in terms of we are requesting that all the center of excellence should have a weekly PC, and with all the health facilities, they should also see that The content curation should be done by age based on the priority area identified and particularly focus on the facilities where high case mortality is noted. There is a need to focus on documentation and sharing of data. And we also need to ensure that we have put up a Google form where you can raise your issues, particularly the facilities and center of excellence can raise their issues and concerns in advance, which can be discussed in these weekly meetings. I would just like to highlight that specific clinical concerns have been raised by a few of the center of excellence whom we have interacted earlier. And this is like from critical care, use of therapeutic anticoagulant and EGXS biomarkers from Himachal Pradesh, can HFMC or hyperbaric therapy usage other than not to use ventilator. So these are the technical questions which are emerged. And like I said, it needs to be done at the technical level, so I am not going to detail. We'll be sharing it with AIIMS also as an input so that they can sort of plan their discussion with all the center of excellence based on this. The issues related with antiviral drugs versus STQ, avoiding advisable usage and dosage of steroid, heparin, and remdesivir, how much, what frequency, and in what type of cases, and impact of dengue and chikungunya as co-infection with COVID-19. So these are the technical issues which are emerged. We would request that kindly we focus on that. And with these, I would kindly request ma'am and then if we
I think over to Dr. Guleria, please.
Thank you very much, ma'am. I hope I'm doing it. And let me take the opportunity to thank you for and not for this thing to.
your voice is breaking, please.
Sir, your voice is not clear. Everybody, please.
So sorry for this slight technological glitch. So I'll just like to start by
Mike, ये वाला
I'd just like to start by thanking the ministry for this initiative. I think it's really required because the aim is to basically decrease mortality, and as was shown by the presentation by Love Agarwal, that there is actually a higher mortality in some states, and we need to work aggressively as far as this is concerned. We at AIIMS have been trying to see how we can improve our management strategy, and we've been working for almost last 3 months aggressively on this. We've managed more than 4,300 patients. At one time, we had more than 800 patients admitted at our trauma center and NCI Jhajjar, which is now come down to some extent. But we've learned a lot, and we would be very happy to share our experience with the other centers of excellence and also learn from them in terms of the management strategy. We've come a long way from what we started off. We started off with giving different types of drugs, drugs which were used for HIV, like lopinavir, ritonavir. The data did not support that. We moved on to hydroxychloroquine. We realized that oxygen therapy is very useful, and therefore aggressive oxygen therapy became one of the treatment strategies. Prone positioning was also important. Conscious proning was the other thing that has come up. We had started giving steroids early, but now there is a large body of data, especially the studies using dexamethasone, which shows that the steroids actually are really beneficial, and therefore that they play an important role as far as management is concerned. There are also studies which then supported the role of anticoagulants. We were not using anticoagulants that aggressively in the beginning, but now it's something that we use very aggressively both in prophylactic doses and subsequently in therapeutic doses. Newer modalities have also come along the way. We've had these 3 new modalities which are still of questionable benefit, and I think it's important for us to really understand the risk benefit before we start using them. This includes plasma therapy, the remdesivir, and tocilizumab. For example, plasma therapy has been there for a very long time. We know that it's been used for a large number of other diseases. It was used even during the H1N1 pandemic in 1918, more recently in Ebola. But the data, as far as its utility is concerned, is still not that strong. We are all aware that a recent paper published in JAMA did not actually find benefit. And there was one interesting article which is in preprint from Holland, which actually shows that when they looked at the antibodies in the patients that they were giving plasma, majority of them, 80%, already had antibodies, and therefore the plasma was of limited use. And this study was actually halted midway because it did not show any benefit. Even when you look at remdesivir, it has still not been shown to be of much benefit. The data actually shows that it decreases hospitalization by only 4 days and it has no mortality benefit. Also, it's useful only in moderate to severe cases. In our setup, we use it if your saturation is falling dramatically, if it's come down to less than 94%, and if you have pulmonary infiltrates. In mild cases, there is really no data to show that remdesivir is useful. And I think there is this huge chance that these drugs will get misused and they have significant side effects, which we are noticing. Even if you look at the studies, large number of patients could not take remdesivir, and the side effects were almost to the tune of 60 to 70%. The third drug which is becoming popular is tocilizumab, an anti-IL-6 drug. Again, this is a double-edged sword because although it decreases the inflammation, it also predisposes to secondary infection, which could be fungal infection and which could also be secondary bacterial infection. Therefore, it's very important for all of us to know where to use what drug and not really start using drugs irrationally, because that can cause more harm than good. We are learning as we sort of go along this journey of managing COVID-19, and we will change our strategy as things go along. But I think it's important for all of us to share our experiences and see how we can actually improve. And this is something we learned. We also have a process where we talk to hospitals, that we're doing this regularly twice a week and talking to them in their doctors working in the ICU, and we realize that very different hospitals are using different strategies because the evidence is not there. One hospital actually on Wednesday told me that they were using methylene blue for many patients, and that is something, there is no literature to support the use of methylene blue. Another hospital was using very high dose ivermectin because of the fact that when you have a new or a novel virus for which you are not sure what is available, people will use a lot of medications based on social media or not based on that much of scientific evidence for what they hear. So the reason for having this center of excellence is basically to be able to have evidence-based and rational treatment, which will ultimately be able to save lives rather than cause more harm. And that is why we are trying to hold these regular meetings where it's an exchange of ideas, there's a discussion of questions that may arise, and also to be able to discuss some topics so that we can give some evidence base as to how you should manage these patients with the aim of decreasing the case fatality. Our ultimate aim should be that no patient should die, whether it be delay in diagnosis, whether it be delay in shifting, or whether it be aggressive management. And it should happen at all levels, whether it be a tertiary care hospital, a state hospital, or even a district hospital. We should develop strategies knowing our limitations and knowing how best we can use the resources that we have to manage patients. And that is the basic aim for having the center of excellence in different states, so they can mentor people even down to the state, district level and help. We'll move on now to the next part of our today's webinar, today's program for the Center of Clinical Center for Excellence. And I'll have one of my colleagues, Dr. Karan Madan, actually now giving a short presentation on the medical management of severe COVID-19. And then we will have a question answer session. I would actually want that we have small presentation, but a lot of discussion between all of you, so that we are able to understand your doubts and be able to answer them, so that you are able to manage your patients in a better manner. So the focus should be more on interaction and question answers, and just a brief presentation of certain topics. So we'll have a brief presentation and then we can have discussion and your own comments and any queries or doubts that you have. And I would then want that you develop centers of excellence in your states where you could mentor doctors who need advice in the management of COVID-19 at each state. And that would actually help in the transfer of knowledge even down to the grassroots level. Thank you very much. And before I finish, maybe I'd like, if there is anything else the Health Secretary, Madam, would like to add.
Thank you very much. Very rightly, you put this hype that people are having over MCP and that other medicine, what is it, tocilizumab, without realizing that they can have very, very severe side effects, and you know, they are being sold in black market. And I think our doctors should ensure that no hype is created, because many of the private hospitals are actually asking the patients to go and buy, and then you know they arrange in black market, so it's not done. When there is no tangible benefit, we should ensure that at least patients are not released. I think as Dr. Saab said that we are able to manage well with oxygen and steroids, and that's the way to go. And early hospitalization is the key.
Okay, so I'll begin. This is a very can you just stop this? Okay, so I'll give a very brief presentation on the overview of management of severe COVID. This is not a very detailed description of the available literature and the studies. This is just reiterating the points of basic management that we propose and has been clearly outlined in the ministry guidelines also, that what are the components of management of severe COVID. So once we approach these patients, for the sake of clinical clarity, the severity of illness has been classified into mild, moderate, and severe forms. Basically, any patient who's hypoxemic, that is, his saturation is less than 94% on room air, classifies as a case of moderate COVID and with a respiratory rate of more than 24 per minute. Now, if we talk about severe patients, these are the patients who have severe respiratory distress, who are hypoxemic, whose saturation is less than 90% on room air, who are tachypneic with a respiratory rate of more than 30 per minute, or patients with established ARDS or septic shock. It is important to realize that moderate to severe disease is a continuum, and both these group of patients need hospitalization and continuity of care. The components of management can be broadly divided into three categories. One is what are the investigations you perform, the supportive care that we give, and the specific treatment strategies for these patients. For lab investigations, an assessment of the clinical history and comorbidities is very important. You measure the vital signs and keep a watch on the saturation. A chest X-ray should be obtained initially and periodically in all patients. A complete blood count, liver and renal function tests should be obtained ideally daily. C-reactive protein levels, D-dimer levels, ferritin should be performed if available and repeated every 72 hours. A 12-lead ECG should be obtained in each patient, and other investigations depending on the comorbidities should be obtained. Regarding supportive care, the most important thing is oxygen therapy, and we'll have a detailed discussion in the next talk. And you target a saturation of 92 to 96%. And you have additional modalities of giving oxygen, which include a non-invasive ventilation, high-flow nasal cannula. And if the patient is not, improving with oxygenation on these modalities, initiation of invasive mechanical ventilation. We have to give thromboprophylaxis, hemodynamic support. Antibiotics should not be routinely given in all patients unless there is a clear evidence of a bacterial infection. And symptomatic treatment, including control of fever, cough, and hydration, should be ensured in all patients. Another very important modality which helps in patients with hypoxemia is something called as awake proning. And I'd like to just dwell on one slide on this. Uh, so basically, awake proning means that proning is classically described in patients who are on mechanical ventilation. Now we have data that even patients who are, conscious and hypoxemic, if they are made to lie on their abdomen, like you see in the figure here, the dependent portions of the lower lobes of the lungs now become non-dependent and they get better ventilated. So this has improvements in the oxygenation. So basically, this can be tried in patients who have requirements of oxygen usually more than 4 liters per minute. The patient should be able to understand the commands and able to change the position himself or herself to to employ this modality. Corticosteroids may be considered. You have options between IV methylprednisolone in a dose of 0.5 to 1 milligram per kilogram, or with the availability of recent data, dexamethasone in a dose of 0.2 to 0.4 milligram per kilogram. This should be given preferably within 48 hours of admission, and should be especially considered in patients whose oxygen requirement is increasing, or if the inflammatory markers are increased. The initial dosage can be up to 3 days, but the duration of administration can be increased as per the clinical response. This is a recent data which came from the recovery trial. The complete data set is still awaited, but which showed that oral or IV dexamethasone in a dose of 6 milligram per day up to 10 days reduced the 28-day mortality in patients who are requiring ventilatory support or those who are requiring oxygen. Now, let us come to the investigational therapies. These are the therapies for which the evidence is not very strong. Another important concern is their limited availability, and they should be reserved for a defined subgroup of patient, as was highlighted by Dr. Valeria. And the three investigational therapies include remdesivir, convalescent plasma, and tocilizumab. Remdesivir is an antiviral drug. It has shown activity against SARS coronavirus 2 and also other viruses like the SARS and the MERS coronavirus. According to recent data, which was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, it reduced the recovery time in adults hospitalized with COVID-19. So the endpoint which we have is a reduced, recovery time, and does not have very strong data as far as mortality benefit is concerned. So remdesivir has been given an emergency use authorization in the MOHFW recommendation. It can be used in patients who are on oxygen, that is moderate disease or greater severity, but they should have none of these contraindications. That is elevated liver enzymes more than 5 times the upper limit of normal, those with severe renal impairment, pregnant or lactating mothers, or children less than 12 years of age. The usual dose is 200 milligram intravenous on day 1, followed by 100 mg daily for 5 days total. But this dose may be increased up to 10 days if required, and it should preferably not be used with hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine. The other investigational therapy is convalescent plasma. This is also an off-label use and can be considered in patients with moderate disease with increasing oxygen requirement, despite the use of corticosteroids. There are certain considerations which one needs to keep in mind, that there should be ABO compatibility and cross-matching of the donor plasma. The neutralizing titer of donor plasma should be above the specific threshold. If that is not met, then the IgG level should be more than 1:640, and you should monitor for any post-transfusion adverse effects and avoid this in patients with IgA deficiency or immunoglobulin allergy. The usual dose is around 200 ml, which is given over a period of more than equal to 2 hours. And another concern in patients with COVID is the possibility of development of a cytokine storm, which is similar to a hemophagocytic lymphohistiocytosis or an HLH. And these patients are at high risk of death without aggressive therapy. So immunosuppression may be considered on a case-by-case basis and may be beneficial in this group of patients. And the options include usually steroid and another agent called as tocilizumab. So tocilizumab is also an investigational therapy antagonist of IL-6, and the inhibition of the IL-6 receptors by tocilizumab leads to reduction in the cytokine levels and the acute phase reactant production. So according to the MOHFW recommendation, off-label use of tocilizumab may be considered in patients with moderate disease with increasing oxygen requirement, or patients who are mechanically ventilated and not improving despite the use of steroids. Considerations may be that may be administered in patients with raised inflammatory markers like CRP, ferritin, and IL-6. The concern of development of secondary infections is there. Therefore, this is also contraindicated in patients with HIV/AIDS, those with other active infections, tuberculosis, active hepatitis, patients with an absolute neutrophil count less than 2000, or thrombocytopenia. The dose is 8 milligram per kilogram in a maximum dose of 800 milligram, and this is given slowly intravenously over 1 hour. And a repeat dose may be considered. So we have some data from multi-center studies on off-label use of tocilizumab, which showed that in patients with severe COVID, treatment led to reduction in inflammatory levels with a 14-day mortality of 11%. No major adverse events was reported in this recently published paper. And we have another paper from the Journal of American Medical Association, which is a randomized trial of 103 patients, and which showed that despite there was no difference in the primary outcome of clinical improvement at day 28, but in patients with severe illness, there were improvement in the clinical symptoms. And importantly, the treatment was safe and no major adverse effects were noted with plasma. WHO also initiated a multi-center international initiative on multiple drug regimens, which is the Solidarity Trial. What has been important from this is that chloroquine and the ritonavir, lopinavir arms have been stopped because they don't show any effect on the mortality. There are other experimental therapies, but evidence of their use in severe diseases is still lacking. So what we have is for the investigational therapies is the convalescent plasma, remdesivir, and tocilizumab in that order. Thank you very much.
You can take the questions.
Thank you. We can just quickly take some of the questions and then have
We can after that the presentation after that. ये भी चल रहा है? ये भी चल रहा है? Try करके.
Audio.
Am I audible right now?
Yes, yes. So, would you like to, I mean, most of the questions which we have got were answered. But in the meantime, while somebody asks, there is one question which has been sent is can we lower the threshold for dialysis for CKD patients? Is usage of hydroxychloroquine prophylaxis effective in such cases?
So I think the question is basically whether we can lower the threshold for dialysis. Threshold for dialysis will remain the same whether you are looking at patients with acute kidney injury or who are having CKD requiring regular dialysis, maintenance hemodialysis. Is usage of hydroxychloroquine prophylaxis effective? Currently, the recommendation for use of prophylaxis of hydroxychloroquine as prophylaxis is basically for healthcare workers and other people who are coming in close contact with COVID positive patients or a close family contact. There is really not much data which is very strong to show that giving it to people with comorbidities may be of much use. And you must remember that this drug also has some side effects. Therefore, hydroxychloroquine currently, the data that we have is basically suggesting that in healthcare workers or in those who are working in a facility where you have an exposure to COVID positive patient, it may be useful for prophylaxis, but there is really no data and no recommendation for it to be used in patients who are either on dialysis or who have associated comorbid conditions for which one would consider giving hydroxychloroquine. So I don't think it should currently be looked at to give it for all high risk group, including the elderly patient. The other question is regarding impact of dengue, chikungunya co-infection with COVID-19. So this is something that I think all of us need to be very careful about, because the symptoms of dengue and chikungunya can be very similar. It's a febrile illness which also presents with body aches, severe body aches, and can have at times symptoms which are similar to that of COVID-19. If you don't have the other upper respiratory tract symptoms. Therefore, a high index of suspicion is needed when you're looking at both cases, and you need to be having to differentiate between the management as far as both are concerned. I don't think we have any data to suggest that one disease aggravates the other. So if you have co-infection with dengue and with COVID-19, I don't think we have any data one way or the other. But I think you have to be very careful in terms of being able to diagnose the two, and therefore in areas where now with the monsoon coming in and vector-borne disease is becoming more prevalent, when you have people with high-grade fever, if the symptoms are more suggestive of dengue, then you must get the NS1 antigen done in the first 5 days, and later on the antibodies in the form of IgM and IG to be done as far as diagnostic workup is concerned, and also, of course, a workup for COVID-19 if that suspicion is there. Antibodies, both IgM and IgG, required for moderate to severe cases. Currently, we are not doing antibodies as a part of diagnostic testing. The focus on diagnosis is basically antigen. So either we do the rapid antigen kit, which is a point of care test. It's useful in symptomatic individuals where if you have a high viral load, it shows a high uptake. But in patients whose viral load is less or who are asymptomatic, the rapid antigen kit may be negative, and therefore it's important that we do the RT-PCR test. We can do the RT-PCR conventionally, or we can even use the CBNAT or the TrueNAT, which is also available in certain states, in certain areas for diagnosing COVID-19. Antibodies usually form later on, and when we looked at our group of patients, we found that in some individuals, the antibodies were coming even after the 10th day. So it is good for serosurveillance, but using it as a diagnostic tool may not be very useful, because you don't know how in a given individual whether they'll be formed early or late, and you can't rely on them from the diagnosis point of view. So I think you will still have to focus basically on the antigen testing kit, either the RT-PCR, the CBNAT, TrueNAT, or the rapid point of care test. One other question which has been raised is testing pre-surgically for vulnerable patient in non-COVID facility. Uh, this is something which is actually evolving. Let me be very honest that most hospitals would ask that any patient who's coming for surgery and you have it falls into a hotspot, they would ask that COVID test should be done, which also is based on two factors. One is, of course, that if you don't want to expose your healthcare workers to the risk of getting COVID infection if you take them up for surgery. We at AIMS have actually divided our OTs into COVID suspect and non-COVID OTs, and anyone who is a COVID suspect and needs emergency surgery, and if the report is also not available, we treat him as COVID positive, and he then goes in for surgery as a COVID positive patient, even if he's a COVID suspect and we're waiting for the report. But for routine elective procedures, whether it be endoscopy, bronchoscopy, or whether it is elective surgery, it's becoming more and more important that we be able to either do the rapid antigen test or the RT-PCR test to rule out COVID infection before we take up these patients for any procedure, both to protect the healthcare worker and for the patient's benefit. Studies now have been there which show that if you have patients who have COVID while the surgery or procedure is done or develop COVID in the next few days, their overall morbidity and mortality is much higher than in non-COVID. One paper actually suggested a mortality of the tune of almost 25 to 30% in as a post-operative complication and mortality in patients who went in for surgery and turned out subsequently had COVID infection. Therefore, I think as far as surgery is concerned, especially in those areas where the uh, infection rate is high, better to delay elective surgery as much as possible till the infection rate comes down. But if you have to go in for a surgery because of, say, it's a cancer or it's something that needs surgery, it can be life saving. It may be worthwhile first to get a COVID test done in the immediate 24 to 48 hours. Remember, getting a COVID test done 10 days before is not something which will be useful because in the intervening 10 days, the patient may still have got the infection. And that I think is something that you need to keep in mind. I've tried to answer some of the questions that were raised as far as specific clinical concerns are concerned. There are others which my colleagues will also be able to take up. And then if you still have some questions or queries, I think you could just send it to us to the chat box or raise your hands and we could ask you those questions. Some of them we will take up which have come from various states. Maybe I can ask Dr. Rajeshwari who can answer some of these questions regarding the therapeutic use of
Yeah, good afternoon. Am I audible? Can all of you hear me?
they can.
Okay. So I'll be just first dealing with the question of can HFNC or hyperbaric therapy usage avoid the need to use ventilators. So hypoxemia is one of the most classic presenting features of the patients with COVID, and it's very important to try to differentiate them into those two known phenotypes. We all know that there's an L phenotype and there's an H phenotype. The L phenotype is the person who's slightly less affected, we put it that way. He's still got good lung compliance and they improve with the normal modes of oxygenation. They're not very breathless, that they're not exerting any extra effort to breathe. So that means their transthoracic pressures and their transpulmonary pressures are still low and they are less candidates to inflict injury on themselves. So patients who are in this stage or patients who are less symptomatic and they may be hypoxemic but not looking tachypneic, not looking distressed, we can use normal methods to oxygenate them like nasal prongs or a face mask or venturi devices. The high flow nasal cannula is not available everywhere, but it has really made the therapy of oxygen treatment very radical and good in these patients because it improves the patient's, reduces the patient's work of breathing. It provides some amount of CPAP, and more than anything, the high flow rates which it delivers it reduces the patient's effort. That is, the patient doesn't have to make an extra effort to reach that peak inspiratory flow. So the high inspiratory flow rates are covered by the HFNC so that it prevents any dilution of oxygen. And secondly, it leads to washout of excess carbon dioxide from the patient's system. And because it provides some amount of CPAP, it also reduces the cardiac workload and improves recruitment of the alveoli. So HFNC is a very good secondary tool, as I may put it, if the patient is not seeming to settle down on the normal oxygen devices like a venturi or a face mask. In lieu of HFNC, we can use even non-invasive ventilation, which can be either given by a very tight fitting mask or a helmet, which is nowadays available all over the country. The advantage of using a helmet is that it is supposed to reduce aerosol generation to quite a bit. Now, the difference between HFNC and NIV is primarily because the non-invasive ventilation has got maximum flows of about 20 to 30 liters, which still may not be able to overcome the patient's high inspiratory flow rates if he is becoming very dyspneic. So, in that case, there is still a possibility that he may exert very high negative intrathoracic pressures and then induce his own lung injury by causing edema and fluid retention and atelectasis. And also, the NIV helmet is very oppressive, has more humidity. There may be some amount of CO2 retention which patients might find very difficult to tolerate. So, the compliance is not as good with NIV helmets as it is with the HFNC. Then, as Dr. Guleria mentioned, proning is very, very important. So, if the patient is awake and able to listen to you, we also try putting them on any of the oxygenation devices and ask them to prone themselves. If they can't lie down prone continuously for a few hours, then we ask them to first turn to the right side, then prone, and then turn to the left side, and so on, so that they complete at least 8 to 10 hours of prone ventilation in this way. Um, Definitely, there is enough evidence to show that the use of HFNC has reduced the need to intubate drastically. There are some studies which show that intubation has been reduced to about only 1% when HFNC is being used. There's a lot of variation in the choice of patients, so we still don't have the ultimate word on HFNC. But in our practice in AIMS, because it was made available for use, we have found that it is extremely useful in patients who may not do very well after intubation. We all know that the very morbidly obese patient is not a good candidate for intubation because it is very difficult to ventilate them. The pressures required to ventilate them are very high often, and to prone them or to position them is very, very, very difficult. So we have found especially that in this subgroup of patients, HFNC has been really very useful, and it has avoided the need for intubation altogether. Coming to hyperbaric oxygen therapy, there are a few papers published because how hyperbaric oxygen works is that when we are breathing oxygen at ambient atmospheric pressure, there's about 0.3 ml of oxygen which is dissolved in every 100 ml of blood. If you breathe 100% oxygen, then this is increased to about 1.5 ml per 100 ml. If we breathe oxygen at 2 to 3 atmospheres pressure, then this can be increased to nearly 5 to 6 ml per 100 ml, which is very much equal to the oxygen extraction which the body needs, so that then, independent of hemoglobin, we have our oxygen delivery. Hyperbaric oxygen has been published in anecdotal case reports, but there has been no controlled study as yet. But it holds a lot of promise because not only does it improve the oxygenation, it prevents intubation, but it is seen to have some amount of immunosuppressive activity as well. It is said that the nascent oxygen which is released, it can actually, to some extent, suppress the cytokine storm which can occur in patients at a later date. So, hyperbaric oxygen therapy still remains to be seen in our country. Though I would feel that in centers which have it, it must be given a good trial for people who are not responding well to the conventional oxygen therapy.
Any other question?
No, sir, I think that has answered some of the questions raised on non-invasive ventilation. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, take over. So we'll just have a brief presentation also on ICU care in severe COVID patients by Dr. Dalin.
And then we'll.
And then, of course, there are some questions which I see some of them coming up on the chat box. And any other questions left, we'll take it after that.
Hello, good afternoon. So I'll be discussing on the ICU care of severe COVID-19 patients. Just a brief overview about the severe and critical disease, and then I'll be talking about the various types of respiratory support available, followed by standard ICU care. So the severity of illness, as already Dr. Karan mentioned, that mostly will be getting patients admitted in the hospital when they have oxygen saturation of less than 94% and respiratory rate of more than 24 per minute. They are classified as moderate disease. Now, when the saturation falls to below 90% and respiratory rate increases more than 30, by WHO definition, we call them severe disease. And when they progress to develop ARDS and shock, we call them critical disease. So most likely, you'll be getting in ICU the patients with severe disease and the critical disease, whereas moderate diseases can be treated in the wards. So the basic respiratory support you start with in patients with moderate disease is simple oxygen therapy by a nasal cannula or face mask. So by nasal prong you give around 2 to 4 liters per minute, and by oxygen by face mask you administer 5 to 10 liters per minute with a target oxygen saturation of 92 to 96%. However, you should continue to monitor the respiratory rate as well as the use of accessory muscles of respiration, the work of breathing of the patients. And if you breathing is increasing or there's difficulty in maintaining the oxygen saturation, consider the face mask with the reservoir bags if it is available to you. They are very good in the sense they can administer. You can administer FiO2 up to 1 with them. They are called non-reprodukting face masks, and particularly give close attention and be vigilant about the patients who are at risk of developing severe disease. Those are predominantly the elderly males and having associated major comorbidities like diabetes and hypertension. In severe disease, it is prudent to start with oxygen therapy by non-reproducing masks if they are available, but they need flow rate a bit higher, about 10 to 15 liters per minute to provide good FiO2. However, in such patients, always start with awake prone sessions, as Dr. Karan and Dr. Guler has already mentioned, and keep a very low threshold for using hypronasal cannula oxygen if available. Now, one important aspect which has been mentioned in the care of these severe COVID patients is the group of patients who seemingly are happy or silent hypoxemic. So this is basically the fact that the patients who in the face of severe hypoxemia will not have significant elevation of the respiratory rate. Even in our series, we have seen that people presenting with oxygen saturation of below 90% have respiratory rate of around 24 to 28, not more than that. So beware of this subset of populations and administer oxygen at the earliest. Now, regarding awake prone sessions, you can the utility is that you can use it with any kind of oxygen devices like face mask, nasal cannula, and hypronasal oxygen, but prefer only in patients who is able to change the positions without assistance. The minimum duration of awake prone session, which have been found to be effective in COVID-19 pneumonias in various series, is 3 to 6 hours. However, ask the patients to continue it as long as possible, as long as they can. You can assess the improvement in the oxygenation within first 5 to 10 minutes. The small series which have been available so far have demonstrated that there may be decrease in the intubation rate in significant number of patients, and as many as 50 to 75% of patients have been shown to respond to these awake prone sessions in small series, however. Now, coming to high flow nasal oxygen device, in severe disease, when it is not possible to maintain oxygenation with oxygen by face mask, consider high flow nasal oxygen devices. You start with a flow rate of 60 liters per minute and FiO2 1, the highest possible setting, and then you can titrate with the patient's oxygenation. The range of flow requirement will be 30 to 60 liters, and FiO2 you can provide is in the range of 0.5 to 1. Now, the basic mechanism, as Professor Raeshwar has already mentioned, that it administers higher flow, the peak inspiratory flow is matched, and it also provides some amount of PEEP, about 5 centimeter waste flow. So it helps significantly in alleviating the dyspnea and the work of breathing. Moreover, it provides heated and humidified oxygen, which is beneficial for the patients. So for the largest series of HFNO which is available, not in the COVID patients, of course, but previously in acute hypoxemic respiratory failure, the subset of population which benefit most with the use of HFNO is the non-hypercapnic population. So if you are encountering patients with acute hypoxemic respiratory failure who are non-hypercapnic, consider HFNO. It has consistently been shown to reduce the intubation rate, improve the ventilator-free days, and the 90-day mortality as well. The implication of improving the ventilator-free days is that not only it reduces primary intubation, it also reduces secondary re-intubation rate. That is, you can extubate patients over HFNO, and the re-intubation rate in such cases become low. In COVID-19 pneumonia, there are two small series available so far with the use of this high flow nasal oxygenation. Both have shown significant improvement, and in one small series in 10 patients from China, combination of HFNC with avectoning by 16 hours a day have shown 100% survival rate and no subsequent intubation or requirement of NIV. Now, NIV is another device, but the difference between NIV is that you need to have an ICU ventilator or a small. You need to provide positive pressure ventilation. Here you use the NIV similarly. The indication is similar as HFNC, that is patients with severe pneumonia who are desaturating even on oxygen therapy by face mask. You start with the pressure support of 5 to 10 centimeter of H2O and a peak of around 5 to 10 centimeter H2O, titrated to target oxygenation of more than 92%. Now, the one important concern regarding NIV is that that the patients in whom they have high inspiratory drive, there can be increased tidal volume delivery, and it may be possible that they will be causing self-inflicted lung injury. So you need to titrate your pressure support so that the target tidal volume administered does not reach above 7 to 8 ml per kg. And another important issue is that in patients who are hypercapnic on presentation may not do well with HFNC. In those patients, they may require some amount of inspiratory pressure support as well. So NIV will be a good device to choose in those subset of patients. For example, patients presenting with COPD exacerbation on top of COVID-19 pneumonia or asthmatic patients. So in them, you can choose NIV over HFNC.
So you are not audible, sir.
10 to 30 minutes. Better that patient should be intubated early without waiting for the fast intubation to happen. However, few patients may require intubation for circulatory or neurological failure as well. So the patients in whom invasive mechanical ventilation has been initiated, the ventilation strategy which we should adopt is lung protective ventilation. The lung protective ventilation basically means an open lung approach where you administer low tidal volume ventilation, initiated with 6 ml per kg, and respiratory rate of 15 to 35 per minute. The titrate tidal volume 6 ml per kg, and you can come down to 4 or maximum of 8 ml per kg, titrated with the plateau pressures, which should always be checked by applying an inspiratory pause in the ventilator and be maintained below 30 centimeter of H2O. This is very important to prevent any ventilator associated lung injury. Now, FiO2 and PEEP you have to titrate. Majority of these patients will require higher PEEP to begin with, 10 to 15 centimeter of H2O, and do not aim for very high oxygenation. A PO2 of 55 to 80 and an SpO2 of 88 to 95% should be good enough. PEEP titration can be done based at the bedside with the base compliance method. You can check the compliance of the patients in the ventilators, or you can target a driving pressure of less than 16. The driving pressure you can easily calculate by subtracting P from the plateau pressure, and try to keep a driving pressure below 16 centimeter of H2O. However, all these patients should be on good sedation and muscle relaxation at times if required. Liberally use heavy sedation and muscle relaxant in the beginning phase of the ARDS. And when patients PO2 FiO2 ratio is less than 150, consider prone position. One of the most important modalities of therapy in severe ARDS patients, which have consistently shown to improve mortality and survival benefit, is prone position ventilation. So whenever you have a patient with refractory hypoxemia, PF ratio of less than 150, in spite of high FiO2 of more than 0.6 or PEEP of more than 5 to 10 centimeter of H2O, do prone these patients. The predominant contraindication is the hemodynamic instability. All these patients should be in good sedation and paralysis before proning, and you can identify if the patient is prone responder or not by doing an ABG and seeing if PO2 is rising by 10% or by 20 millimeter of mercury within 1 to 4 hours of initiation of prone. If the patient is prone responder, do continue with the prone for 16 hours at least a day for consecutive days. However, do remember that these patients need very careful positioning, good coordination between your staffs. You have to be very careful about the pressure points and the eye care. And in subsequent days, monitor the patient's response by lung mechanics in the ventilator as well as by ABG. And when the PF ratio improves to more than 200 with an FiO2 setting of less than 0.5 and PEEP of less than 10 centimeter ratio, in an ABG which is done at least 4 hours after resupination, then you can end the prone sessions any further. Now, investigations mostly has been talked about by Dr. Karan. Few important points I would like to mention. The main radiological investigations, what we do in ICUs is chest X-ray, lung ultrasound, and CT scan. Here, CT scan, getting it done will be extremely difficult at times. And you need to have a dedicated portable chest X-ray machine available inside your COVID ICU. So what you can do more liberally is the use of point of care ultrasound at the bedside. Most of the doctors who are working in ICUs are aware of it and do use lung ultrasound. It shows important findings in the COVID patients. Our preliminary analysis shows that most of the patients will have bilateral B profile with presence of pleural thickening and lung threads, and pleural effusion is extremely rare. So you can first identify the extent of damage, then subsequently your response to the respiratory therapy you administer by doing bedside lung ultrasound at least 2 or 3 times a day. Again, ABG is very, very important, and you should have an ABG machine kept inside the ICU to alleviate the problem of repeated transfer of samples from the ICU to the lab. And beware of co-infections and secondary infections, which we have been already discussed. And control of comorbidities are very, very important. Most of the patients who will end up in your ICU with severe disease will be elderly patients with associated comorbidities. Diabetes and hypertension have been the predominant comorbidities even in India. So be well versed with the control of these diseases in the ICU. Few other important aspects we should be aware of in the ICU. That is, one important point is aerosol precautions. So always do use closed suction systems in the ICU. In the picture, you can see the closed suction system. It reduces the need of any disconnection of the ventilator. So do always use this closed suction and use HME or the viral filters in the endotracheal tube. And if at all you need to disconnect a patient, always put a ventilator in the standby mode before you disconnect. Few guidelines have suggested clamping the endotracheal tube before disconnection, but please do not do that, because only in paralyzed patient you can do clamping. If the patient has any spontaneous breathing efforts, do not do endotracheal tube clamping, because that can cause further injury and negative pressure pulmonary edema. Nebulization, you have to be very careful, but do use nebulization. This will not really do much of aerosol generation. And regarding intubation, prefer to use video laryngoscope if it is available with you, and experienced person should attempt intubation to prevent or reduce the risk of aerosol generation. Therefore, in all the shifts, and anesthesia personnel should be available in the ICUs for intubation if required. Down the line, you may have to do many tracheostomies. You have the option of doing surgical tracheostomy, and if you are already experienced to do percutaneous tracheostomies in the ICU, then please do that. With some due precautions for aerosol prevention. The most important tips would be that you expose the neck and the trachea first before you insert the bronchoscope inside the endotracheal tube, and an experienced person should do that so that the duration can be shortened, and use the end tidal carbon dioxide monitoring for confirmation of the tube placement rather than repeat bronchoscopies again to minimize the disconnection and leak. Regarding CPR, it has been found to be safe in COVID positive patients. The only main difference from the conventional CPR is that consider intubation very early during the process of CPR, and again the experienced person should do the intubation. And during the time when you are using bag and mask ventilation with AMBU or any other devices, always use this HME or the viral filters between the mask and the bag or the circuit. Now, needless to say, the most important part is the standard ICU care, since we are still trying to search for the definitive drug The standard ICU care is most important, and prevention of further complications is most important part of the therapy. Regarding fluid management, the important tips is that the most of the guidelines suggest that we should be very conservative about the fluid management, but don't be too restrictive initial phase of the ICU admission days, because most of these patients will be coming with history of few days of fever and respiratory distress, so they will be dehydrated, particularly in this hot and humid summer of India. So initially you be a little bit liberal about the fluid administration strategies, but be guided by your recurrent use of point of care ultrasound, urine output, and ABG data. The head end of bed elevation should be maintained by 30 to 45 degree in all patients who are intubated in the ICU. This is standard of care. Exception is that in patients when you are doing CPR, the bed should be flat, and the patients who are kept in prone position, in mechanical ventilation prone position, those patients should be given only 10 to 15 degrees of head up tilt. Try to initiate enteral nutrition early within 24 to 48 hours. A low molecular heparin prophylaxis is very important, and most often in severe disease, you'll be using twice daily dose in such patients of COVID pneumonia. Precaution is the patients with end-stage renal disease and those who develop AKI in the ICU with creatinine clearance of less than 30. In those patients, use unfractionated heparin 5,000 twice a day and do not use low molecular heparin. Stress ulcer prophylaxis, good sedation and paralysis I've already discussed. And once the patient starts improving on ventilator, start using weaning protocol, daily sedation breaks, and trial for spontaneous breathing in the morning rounds. Now, a few words about importance of nursing care. As we all know that nursing care is of course an essential and integral part of ICU management. Here, you may have at times problem of getting untrained and semi-trained nurses in the ICU in the face of a surge. So, few basic points you should train them. One important aspect is the chlorhexidine sponge baths, oral and eye cares, and positioning, because nurses do have to interact with the patients regularly when they are in awake prone or in prone with the mechanical ventilation. To train them in infection prevention bundles like catheter-related bloodstream infection, then urinary catheter-related infections and ventilator-associated pneumonia. The prevention bundle should be taught to them properly, and again the aerosol precautions. Few practical tips at the end. The healthcare providers which will be getting starting from doctors till the group D staffs, the Hs and the Ss, do good donning and doffing training sessions in them before they go inside the ICUs, because they otherwise without proper training they can harm themselves and spread the risk of infection to others as well. Another important limitation always will be the visibility and the hearing impairment of healthcare providers who are working in the ICU. Once you don and go inside the ICUs, most of the times, which have been universally reported all over the world, is the fogging of the goggles, and because of people will not be able to hear much. So the tips are that when you need to do some procedures in the ICU, always try to send an experienced person freshly donned just for doing the procedures. You can do the procedures within first 1 hour of his entering the ICU before too much of fogging occurs. The vital charts which sisters do maintain should be with larger fonts to avoid any problems. The communication should be loud and clear and closed loop communication among the healthcare providers, and use phones with bright screens and loud ringtones inside the ICU. And another important aspect from the patient perspective is that majority of the patients will be inside the ICU, and the relative visit may be restricted because most of the family members may themselves be quarantined and may be suspects. So this is kind of an aligned environment for the patients when they see the people in PP roaming around them. So it's very important to reduce the stress and anxiety of the patients, that you communicate with them properly every day during the rounds and subsequently in other time by the nurses and the doctors in each shifts, and the relatives should be updated daily. So to summarize, from the therapeutic point of view, awake proning should be used early in patients who are on oxygen by face mask, and if the patient is having persistent hypoxia in face mask, initiate HFNO as early as possible. And you should have laid down protocols, and intubation should be planned and executed early rather than waiting for the patient to collapse. On intubated patients, use lung productive ventilation strategy and consider proning sessions early when they develop refractory hypoxemia. You can use HFNO for the patients to extubate to reduce the reintubation rates. And point of care ultrasound can be considered as primary bedside radiological investigation of choice. And the most important is the standard ICU care and prevention of complications. Thank you.
So, there any questions we can take them.
We've just shared a list of collated concerns that have come from the live chat. If there are questions that could be addressed, would be very helpful. Some of them are on trisectomy and the time as well. So if we could start with the treatment protocol, it would be
Can
very
you just put up
helpful.
the chat? So in the meantime, there's one question on vascular disease, which I will just answer, which is identification and treatment of myocardial infarction in a patient with COVID. So just say, there are two kinds of myocardial infarction which have been seen. One is in the severe patients who have, because of the mismatch in the supply demand, they have what is called the type 2 MI. That is, they have high troponin levels, not the conventional MI. But the treatment for that essentially remains treatment for severe COVID, including whatever has been mentioned, including anticoagulation. The other type of the conventional MIs which we see, which is the ST elevation MIs, uh, they were they potentially can be higher in them because there is a procoagulant state that COVID is. But in our experience over the last 2 months, we've not really seen any rise in patients coming with MI because of COVID. There may be people who come with MI but have concomitant infection. Of course, they need to be managed more carefully with full PP, and we do more of thrombolysis rather than doing primary angioplasty. And once we've tested, we can then take them off for angioplasty. So, in the meantime, any other? How much negative balance can be allowed while restricting fluids? Alim, you're like.
Yeah. So to begin with, you can target around 0 to 500 ml of positive balance. In fact, in the initial few days in the ICU, like initial day 1 to day 3, and subsequently, depending on your findings in the lung ultrasound and urinary output, you guide fluid resuscitation. I would suggest initially not to go for negative balances, rather maintain 0 to slight positive balance. And once the patient is on, say, in mechanically ventilated patients, in them you need to do a negative fluid balance, predominantly day 4, day 5 onwards. When you are sure that the AKI has not developed, the lung is not worsening further, then when the weaning is started, you go for more of negative fluid balance. Uh, early CT.
There's a question on value of early CT. So I think early CT is not essentially for diagnosis. I think diagnosis initially would rest on your, the RT-PCR and the antigen-based test. The From a management point of view, doing a CT scan early really does not add much until you want to rule out some complication. But otherwise, the management is on a bedside ultrasound and a chest radiograph only. There is some patients who are, say, RT-PCR negative and there is a high suspicion of COVID. There is some data to suggest that there may be some particular CT scan patterns which may be very suggestive of COVID. Many centers do CT scans in these patients on routine, but that is not something which should be advised on routine. So CTs or frequent CTs don't really figure much in the management protocol.
It is mentioned.
There is a question in an I am in an ICU without negative pressure. Is it safe to use HFNO with flow above 30 liters per minute in view of risk of aerosol generation? See, the negative pressure can be easily achieved by increasing the flow through the AHU in your ICUs. So you just need to ask your engineers to do at least 6 to 12 air exchange in the ICU through the dedicated AHUs. And with that, then using an HFNO will not be harmful any longer. Ma'am, your inputs.
Actually, the HFNO has been found to cause less of aerosol generation compared to the Venturi mask and the NIV systems. And also, the patient with an HFNO can be asked to wear a normal, simple mask. That will also consistently reduce the amount of aerosol generated. So, you can safely use HFNO with flow up to 60 liters, provided the patient is wearing a simple mask. And you don't have to risk or worry about aerosol generation.
Any other questions you have other than that on the chat? I think most of this is covered. One is when can we think that HFNO is failing?
So, in a patient who has got persistent tachypnea and oxygen saturation is not being maintained above 92%, then you consider failure of HFNO. So, but do give a trial of HFNO up to FiO2 of 1 and flow liters of 60 per minute. In spite of that, if the patient has persistent hypoxia and desaturation, it's preferable that you go and do intubation early rather than going a secondary trial with NIV.
Tracheostomy after how many days of intubation?
We normally would like to perform a tracheostomy, especially if the patient is not improving, because as the days go by, they need better ventilatory management and better physiotherapy. So here it is practice to time a tracheostomy after, at the most, after 2 weeks. So, and depending on the condition of the patient, if the patient is turned RT-PCR negative, one can do it in a normal theater. But it is assumed that the patients will continue to shed virus as long as they're on ventilation. So, it is advisable to do the tracheostomy in a protected OT or a percutaneous tracheostomy in the ICU. But we normally give an outer margin of about 2 weeks. I'll give it to Dalim to confirm.
See, as ma'am said, we do that in COVID patients. We do a little bit late tracheostomy after 10 to 12 days, and if possible, you do a repeat test and see if the patient is negative. Then you will be very much sure about the risk of infection you will have is almost negligible. But however, delaying it beyond 2 weeks may be harmful for the patients, particularly when they have already they are developing secondary infections. So then it's preferable that you do with all sorts of precaution, prefer in a COVID positive theater, a surgical tracheostomy.
The other question was on antibiotic.
I think there's one more question on the antibiotic protocols in these patients. So there's no specific antibiotic protocol per se. Yeah, initially, if you feel that the duration was too short, and if it's a moderate patient, you can do without antibiotics if you don't have clinical suspicion of a bacterial infection. But in case you have symptoms and signs which point to a bacterial infection, a broad spectrum antibiotic cover according to your setting, which is your preference, may be undertaken based on your sensitivity specificity data. In our setting, we would usually use an initial antibiotic, which would be something like a piperacillin tazobactam or a cefoperazone sulbactam combination on a case-by-case basis in addition with an anti-staphylococcal antibiotic, and then modifying it based on the cultural reports. So no specific protocol per se.
There is one question on our experience of ICU psychosis. To be honest, ICU psychosis is common in COVID-19 ICUs, but so far the patient setup which we have got predominantly the elderly patients with severe disease and hypoactive delirium rather than hyperactive delirium we have found more commonly in these patients. The main risk factors are that most of them have not been communicated properly since their admission, and they are kind of afraid of people roaming around in PPs around them. I have experience of a patient telling me that she thought she was cased in a jail and police are guarding around her for many days. by the time she was first informed that she's actually in an ICU of an hospital. So, but most of the patients, the use of good communications is very, very important. So I suggest that the consultants during ICU rounds always talk to the patients and comfort them. And the nursing or the residents present in the evening or night shifts also do talk to them once again. The another difficulty faced by the patients here is that their access to the family and the relatives are limited, almost nil. So what we do is that we inform the relatives or the family daily if the patient is very serious, more than once a day. And it's preferable that you do a video calling with the relatives and make the patient talk to the family or the relatives. That will help them reduce their anxiety, stress, and subsequent development of delirium. And most of these COVID ICUs are rapidly built in a setup which may not be a regular ICU setup. So various protocols, may not be in proper place. One important issue is the access to daylights. So if possible, make patients, particularly who are likely to stay in ICU longer, place them in such places where they have access to daylights. In elderly patients, if they have been using hearing aids and specs in their home, do get these devices and apply on them. So these will be very beneficial. Uh, Give due care to reduce the noise of alarm settings and the ventilator alarms in the night time so that they get good sleeps. So all these small maneuvers go a long way in reducing the amount of psychosis and delirium in the ICU.
What kind of fluid to use? HFNO? Can we use normal water?
Yes. We can use either. We can use normal. Sorry, there was a question that what kind of fluid to be used in HFNO? Can you use normal water or normal saline? You can use either. It's not a issue. It's just for humidification of the inspired air. Patients with severe disease. Procal may not predict the severity of illness. So for severity of inflammatory reaction in these patients, you can use ferritin, D-dimer, LDH, and all this stuff, IL-6. But procalcitonin you do predominantly when you suspect secondary bacterial infections. That is important. And secondly, in cases where you suspect, when you plan to use tocilizumab, then Procal is very important because you need to be 100% sure that the patient is not having any secondary bacterial infection. So in those cases, Procal may be done before we administer tocilizumab therapy.
I think that's covered most of the questions. I mean, one question is on CT values of RT-PCR. That is true. I mean, the higher the CT values, the lower is the viral load. And in fact, one of the papers showed that if it's beyond 34, then that patient may not be infective actually. So that is something which we'll also be dealing in our lab webinar, which we have later. So I don't see any other question. If there is anything else, pharmacological management for ICU psychosis.
Regarding this last question, one important issue is that most commonly used drug for ICU psychosis is haloperidol. The important problem here is that if you are using hydroxychloroquine and on top of that add haloperidol, that will cause significant QT prolongation. So before administering haloperidol, do document the QT interval in a patient who is elderly, have heart disease, or who is on HCQS. Otherwise, you can use fentanyl or dexmedetomidine infusions, which are better agents, short-term agents for controlling psychosis.
The question is on suspecting invasive aspergillosis and COVID ARDS. So I think the suspicion for a secondary, fungal infection would be like in any other patient who's in a critical ill setting. So basically, you suspect, especially if it's a diabetic, or you have some radiological signs which point towards cavitation with a crescent sign. And so in particular settings, the suspicion of would be there, but nothing particular that there are certain pointers towards that in COVID ARDS, according to me.
Okay, so I think if there are no more questions, can we just wind up, Aparajita?
Sure, sir. Thank you so much to the team, Dr. Z and Dr. Roy. I request all the participants, thank you for your time, and you could definitely write back to us through the clinical issues form that is shared on the WhatsApp group. We assure you that all your queries will be documented and shared with AIMS for addressal. I'd just like to hand over to sir to please close the.
Yeah, I'm Dr. Rajiv Garg, BTHS, and it was a very nice session. I think all the panelists, we should thank Dr. Guleria, Dr. Rajeshwari, Dr. Karan Madan, Dr. Athya, and for giving very crisp and clear decisions. I hope that our states and the UTs can raise the standards further for the ICU care, and today's topic of the week was medical management and ICU care for the severe COVID-19. And this way, it will go a long way in reaching the CFR. And, as desired by the Secretary Health, we should meet every week, and you can keep your questions ready. I wish this goes on and the pandemic reduces very soon with all the inputs of all the handlers. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.